Hello there. I'll explain to you what has just happened. I recorded Conversation on Wine Part 3, and it lasted for 27 minutes, in which I talked about everything I want to talk about. But unfortunately, the audio wasn't working, and I can't get the audio to work on my laptop. I just played it back, and there was no audio on it, so I have to re-record all of it on my phone. That's how desperate I am to do this whole thing. So yeah, I'll just go through everything I talked about all over again. It might not be as good, but alas, that's what has happened. So I talked to, first of all, the red wine I'm drinking today is a Carmenet from Valle del Maule, and it's a rather nice grape. And it's probably my favorite grape, actually, and it's a very nice wine from Chile, made in 2012. And let's have a bit of it right now. So hopefully it will last for 27 minutes. If it's not as long, I won't have talked about everything that I talked about in the video I recorded with no audio. Otherwise, it might go over 27 minutes, in which case I would have talked about more, and it would be a better video. So let's hope that happens. So firstly, I will talk about William Faulkner. And there are a lot of modernist writers I like. So basically, William Faulkner is my favourite modernist writer, and he's American. So he uses a lot of the modernist writers I'm not that fond of, like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, but I really like William Faulkner. So he writes about these American communities which have been left behind by urbanization and industrialization, and they're basically like these 19th century families which have been left behind. So he is, but when you read James Joyce, when you read Ulysses, I personally find it impenetrable for me. Other people can make head or tail of it. I can't. Virginia Woolf is a bit dull, she's a bit dreary, she's a bit boring. Samuel Beckett's a bit dreary, it's a bit boring. But I really like William Faulkner. So his best book is probably, one of his best books is The Sound and the Fury, which deals with this family called the Compsons. And again, they're this family which have been this kind of 19th century American Mississippi family, which have fallen behind due to urbanization. And it's kind of similar to what we talk about it in the news at the moment with these, the Rust Belt, which can't keep up with globalization. And, they vote for Donald Trump and all that. And, all these industries no longer exist and these communities are falling behind. But the Compson family are kind of like this 19th century family. And they fallen behind. So there's these three brothers, and they're very different from each other. And the first brother is a mentally challenged, mentally retarded character called Benji. And Benji sees things in a very strange way, and he sees things in a very defamiliarizing, idiosyncratic way. So he will describe things in a very strange way, and Faulkner's very good at this. He says it tasted purple. Caddy smelled like trees. He sees things in a very peculiar way, and Faulkner uses the language to describe how he perceives things. And his sense of time is warped, and it jumps about in time. And Faulkner signals each jump in time by changing from Roman numerals to italics. And he misses his sister Caddy. And he always goes to this fence because he thinks his sister Caddy will be there. And he's not aware that she left the house many years ago. And he keeps thinking that if he goes to this fence, she will be there. And every time he goes to the fence, it jumps in time and he sees her in the fence when the little kids playing together. And Faulkner uses what was called interior monologues and stream of consciousness. Again, that modernist stuff. So he describes modernism was very interested in consciousness and describing how you think. So obviously, every time, say, these 19th century writers like Charles Dickens, Zola, Balzac. They wrote social realism, and of course, we don't think the way social realist writers write. So what the modernists were more interested in was capturing the way we think. So they would write down stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness doesn't necessarily mean you write without structure. You sit down and you write, and you make these associations you wouldn't otherwise make if you weren't using stream of consciousness. And it was about getting into that interior monologue, that stream of consciousness, the way in which we think. And you definitely get that with Benji. He will describe caddy smell like trees. I ate it and it tasted purple. You know, that very idiosyncratic, defamiliarizing language. And he's writing from the perspective of a character who cannot even write, who cannot even speak, or he cannot even speak, or let alone write. So yeah, so that's Benji. And then the second chapter is about a character called Quentin. And Quentin is a Harvard graduate. So there you have a very big, these three brothers are very dissimilar, and they're all obsessed with their sister Caddy, who reappears a lot. And Quentin has a mental breakdown. So it starts off fairly readable, and it gets more and more unreadable, and the language and the syntax deteriorates the more the more he has this mental breakdown, and eventually he commits suicide. And there's a lot of ruminations on the nature of time. I think there's a famous quote from there: "Time only stops when the clock stops. Time only starts when the clock stops ticking." The way in which we disassociate ourselves from time. So Benji, and again, he's obsessed with his sister Caddy. So that's Quentin. Again, Quentin very different from Benji. Benji is mentally retarded. Quentin is a Harvard graduate who's left the Compson family. And the third character is a character called Jason. And Jason is a very unpleasant character. And Jason writes in the vernacular of Mississippi. So he's more socialized. Benji's not socialized at all. Quentin is less socialized because he's less ingrained with the local community, whereas Jason's very much part of that community. And he writes in the vernacular of the South, and he has a lot of racial and sexist, racial and misogynistic prejudices. And this chapter charts him following confusingly, he has a daughter called Quentin, who has the same name as the other character called Quentin. And the final chapter is in third person, and it writes from the perspective of the third person, and it's about the Compson family going to church. So I've just demonstrated the way in which Faulkner writes from very many different perspectives, and the way in which he uses these interior monologues and these stream of consciousnesses, the use of stream of consciousness, to get into the mind of these very strange, unhinged characters. And he shows the way in which these communities have not kept up with urbanization. And sorry, I have a bit more of the wine. And he has another famous novel called As I Lay Dying, and I think that's from the perspective of about 50 different characters. And he shows how they take this coffin of a woman who's just died, deceased, and they're going to give her a burial. And they go through the states, and it's very striking because you read it, and you think it's from the perspective of a 19th century family, and suddenly a car appears. That's a very striking scene. And he has a novel called Absalom, and that's less readable than Sound of the Fury. And I think erroneously, there's an entry in the Guinness Book of World Records that says that's the longest sentence in the history of literature is in Absalom, which I don't think is true, because I think a Polish writer wrote a novel that's 130 pages long. It's all one sentence. But anyway, it has a lot of stream of constant, long unbroken sentences, and Quentin appears in that. The Harvard student appears in that novel, and he has a novel called Night in August. That has more of a linear, A, B, C, D, linear story to it, and that's a bit more readable than the other novels I just mentioned. All right, so that's enough on William Faulkner. So now I'm going to talk about. Sorry about this. I just made a video where I went through all of this and the audio. So pray to God the audio's working on this. Otherwise, fucking hell, it's going to be infuriating. I really want to do this, as you can probably tell. Sam Peckinpah is the second thing I'm going to talk about, and he's a filmmaker. And I was just talking to this about my dad, because my dad saw his films in the 1970s, and he hasn't seen them since. And Peckinpah, what my dad said is he saw them in the 70s, and these images have stayed with him. Since the 70s, he makes these films with these really striking images. And he was well known for using violence in his films. His films are very violent, which is obviously, he's probably like the Quentin Tarantino of the 1970s, except he's a lot more interesting than Tarantino, because the Tarantino films, you watch them once, and you watch them again, and the novelty is kind of worn off. But Peckinpah's probably got a lot more substance to him. So, it's like Peckinpah uses the medium of film to use these images, and Faulkner is very much about using language to describe the interior space monologues of these characters. So Faulkner, they use media, they use these media in different ways. So Faulkner uses languages very well, and Peckinpah uses the medium of film very well. Obviously, they're very different media, but I love both media for different reasons. I did degrees in both. I did a degree in film postgraduate. I did a degree in undergraduate literature. I love both media, but they do different things. With a filmmaker like Peckinpah, an American filmmaker, uses the medium of film to use his images, and Faulkner uses language to do different. They do different things. But Peckinpah, so he has this film called Cross of I'll start with Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. That's just a relentless, just violent scene after violent scene, but just striking images that stay with you. And they're sorry to give the ending away, but he made this film called Cross of Iron. And they have this military base. These Germans are fighting the Russians, and they have this military base. And the ending of the film, the base is being depleted and destroyed by the Russians and their bombs. And basically, there's these two characters left. And one of them is this Prussian guy who wants his cross of iron. He's basically following the tradition of he's being this Prussian military guy. And he's not fond of the Nazis, but he wants his cross of iron. And there's this other guy and the guy who's going to get the Cross of Iron hasn't really fought in any tangible way in a war. He kind of leads them on, but he's never actually really fought head on. And the other guy is very cynical about war. And basically, their base is being destroyed by the Russians. And the cynical guy gives a gun to the Prussian guy. And he says, let's go out there and let's fight. So they go out there into the battlefield with the Russians bombing the living hell out of what's left of the base. And they basically head towards their death. That's a very striking scene. And there's a very good film he made called Straw Dogs. And Straw Dogs is about this mathematician who's very cerebral and very rational. And he goes to the south of England, I think it's Cornwall or something like that, and there's some parallels with the Simon Pegg movie, Hot Fuzz. And he goes there for peace and quiet so as to write a new book about mathematics. And the house gets marauded by these violent people who want to kill them. And, and basically the message of the film is no matter how cerebral we are, no matter how rational we are, we often resort to violence so as to survive in these kinds of situations. And he made a Western film called The Wild Bunch. And I'm not being unfair to Western films in any way. They probably got a lot going for them, but they're often very kind of formulaic. They follow a certain style. But Peckinpah kind of warps that completely with the ending, which is kind of this violent ending. It's just brilliant. All right, so that's enough on Sam Peckinpah. The third thing I was going to talk about was Latin American fiction. And Latin American fiction, sorry, I should have a bit more of the wine. There's these terms that people throw around, and I used to use them a lot more when I was younger, but I'm a bit more skeptical about just using these terms, which often don't really mean much. Like I was just about to mention the term magical realism, which is often used to describe Latin American fiction. But it's very hard to define what it is, so I often try to avoid those kind of terms that I used to use a lot more, like when I was in my early 20s or whatever, like magical realism or postmodernism. And people use these terms, and you often meant to know what you're talking about when no one knows what you're talking about. But often they use that term because the Latin American writers often mix surrealism or fantasy, and they mix it with realism. So I had a bit more of the wine. I'm just going to pour a bit because I had a lot of it whilst I was recording the video with no audio. And I'm recording this all over again. So there's these American fiction. So I'll go through a few writers. Like the most famous one is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which I'm not that fond of him, to be honest. A lot of people like him, but I'm not that fond of him. So there's Julio Cortázar wrote some great short stories. So he wrote this short story called Axolotl, which is about this guy looking at this tank with all these fish. Is that the plural? I'm not sure. Fish is fish. With all these fish in them. And as he looks at them, he becomes a fish himself. And he wrote another short story in which his brother and sister are in this house. And they've lived in this house for years and they've inherited it. And they hear these noises, these sinister noises. And they hear them more and more. And they approach them more and more, until they take over the entire house and they have to get out of the house. And he wrote another short story, and this character just vomits rabbits. That's very strange. And he wrote another short story in which this two guys, and one of them's a widower, and he thinks he has seen a woman who's his wife. And then he looks at it, and he's not sure if it's her, if that's his former wife. That's very striking as well. He wrote a short story in which there's this girl from a poor background, and she feels like she knows someone. No, I think it starts off with a girl from a very rich, wealthy background, and she senses this other girl, and she meets this other poor girl, and they give themselves a hug, and she becomes the poor girl, and she becomes the rich girl. And he wrote a short story where this young girl senses that there's a tiger roaming her house. He wrote another short story in which this guy's reading a crime novel, and he's reading about this criminal who's going to kill someone with a knife, and he appears in the room, and it's him reading. The criminal appears in the room where the guy's reading the book about the criminal. So there's this. Cortázar often writes about these situations. Like we've all often had these. It's very universal to certainly feel deja vu. I've sensed this before. I've dreamt this before, and Cortázar recreates that when you feel this cross between fantasy and reality. And obviously Jorge Luis Borges is another great writer. He wrote The Library of Bell, a library that stores every book ever written. And The Aleph is another great short story in which a guy looks at an object that contains the entire universe. I think The Aleph contains a quote from Shakespeare saying that I will contain within a casket the entire universe, and I will look at it, this small little object containing the entire universe. I think that Shakespeare quote influenced that short story. And there's another similar short story wrote in which called Zaire, where the coin, this guy finds a coin and it contains the entire universe. And he wrote another short story in which this Jewish character is going to be shot, but then he freezes time for 1,000 years before he's shot. Book of Sand. The book contains more and more pages, and it keeps growing and growing and growing. So there you have it, like how a common theme is like endless knowledge, infinity. How there's no end to knowledge. He wrote a short story called Orbis Tertis, which is about this kind of idealist planet, a planet of ideas, as opposed to a materialist planet. That influenced a novel that I later wrote called Planet Zeleny. Borges wrote, obviously, master. People talk about him a lot. For good reason. He's a masterful writer. I like Juan Rulfo. He wrote this short story called Pedro Páramo, in which this guy's mother is dying, and she says, anda Comala porque ahí vive tu padre Pedro Páramo. So he goes to Comala to visit his father who's died. But of course, he goes to this town called Comala, and it's a ghost town, and no one lives there anymore. And the characters that appear in the novel are all dead. And the kind of linearity, there's no linearity to the novel. It's a bit like Faulkner. Like, it jumps in time from these different perspectives in time, from all these characters who are dead, who used to live in this town, this ghost town called Comala. Juan Carlos Onetti is a great writer. He has a novel called A Brief Life, and this guy's dabbling around by writing this piece of fiction, and he keeps it in a desk, and he ends up living in that world in Santa Maria. So there's often that kind of mixing of surrealism, of fantasy with reality. Of course, like, I don't think that's a very precise term, like magical realism. It's hard to define. And then José Donoso, I think I'd skipped Donoso in the previous video, but I'll mention him now. He rewrote some really good books, but my favourite one by him is a book called The Obscene Bird of Night, which is wild, because it's about this schizophrenic character who's a lawyer, and he works for this guy called Ascoita, and he has this maid. It's quite complex, quite convoluted, and he works for this maid that works for this lawyer called Peter Ponce, and he this kind of power, and he works for this lawyer, and he also works for this care home. He's kind of a schizophrenic. He has multiple, and there's this other parallel reality, because the lawyer has this mutant child, and he can't believe that he has this mutant child, and he finds it hideous. So he creates this castle of mutants, so as to shield the mutant child from the real world. So he brings all the mutants from Chile, and he puts them in this castle. And the character Mudito is in charge of this castle as a job for that lawyer, and it kind of sifts between all these delusional parallel worlds. So I've mentioned, these writers have mentioned, often mix surrealism and fantasy, what have you, and realism. But a novelist who's a bit more straightforward is Mario Vargas Llosa. He's a lot more realistic, and the one novel I've read by him is called The Feast of the Goat, and that's about Trujillo, the dictator from the Dominican Republic. And he's also influenced by William Faulkner, so he shifts between multiple perspectives. And he writes from the perspective of a woman in the contemporary world who had been raped by Trujillo, and she goes back to the Dominican Republic. And he writes from the perspective of these guys who are planning a coup so as to murder Trujillo and bring him down. And he writes from the perspective of Trujillo. And that's also really well written. I think he won the Nobel Prize quite recently as well, quite justifiably so. Right, so that's enough on Latin American fiction. Something I mentioned at the start of the previous video, which I didn't mention in this video, is that I probably shouldn't open my mouth on a lot of the things that I talk about, because I'm not an expert on any of these things. So ideally, if you're going to open your mouth on philosophy, especially philosophy or politics, or British political history, ideally you should have a PhD in the subject. But sometimes people are so passionate, they have the curiosity, and they want to open their mouths on these things when they probably shouldn't. Because I mentioned this because I'm going to talk about Schopenhauer a bit, and that's a bit more esoteric, a bit more academic than what I've talked about. The other thing I was going to mention at the start of the video, which I mentioned at the start of the previous video, I'll mention it now, is that I'm interested in history and politics, and I'm interested in philosophy. But my primary interest is probably the arts. So my primary interest is probably literature, film, and music. Although I'm interested in history and politics, and I'm interested in philosophy, but I'm more interested in the arts primarily, and that's what I'm mainly talking about in this video. All right, so I'm going to talk about Schopenhauer. So when I read primary texts in philosophy, I'll read it from cover to cover. I'll sometimes take notes, but I won't remember all of it. And what I mainly remember is the secondary criticism around the topic. So Schopenhauer is a very interesting philosopher. So basically, I mentioned this before I go into I remember mentioning this in between. Basically, like, philosophy looks at the nature of something, at the kind of like the meta, the meaning of things. And the other categories are like the empirical sciences look at the empirical world of nature, the external world as it is, and it shows you the world as it is. And mathematics is kind of abstract and it's about numbers. So those three fields, like philosophy, isn't empirical and it isn't rationalistic. It isn't about numbers either. It is about the nature and the meaning of things, and it's completely different. So people often say like science is kind of so philosophy is kind of pseudoscientific when it's not science. It looks at kind of different. It looks at different things. So let's have a bit more of the wine. So Schopenhauer has this, for him, the world is comprised of representation and it is comprised of will. So that representation bit is kind of derived from Kant, as in every time you see something, it is everything that you see in the material world is filtered through kind of like a subjective prism. And Kant went so far as to say that the thing in itself, the material world, like this table, we can't be entirely sure of it. So Schopenhauer uses that kind of representation. Every time we see the world, we see a representation of the world. And he has this thing called the will, and the will is this kind of irrational energy, and it runs through all subjects and all objects. And the thing in itself is also runs through us, because it's all like, for him, the will, this irrational energy, is kind of unified, monolithic thing. It is one thing. Whereas the individuals that comprise this the world, they make it plural. They make it pluralistic because they're individuals and they're all different, and they create the plurality. Whereas the irrational energy, the will, is this monolithic, unified thing that runs through all subjects and objects. But it's all an irrational energy. All plants, all material objects, all humans, all subjects, all individuals, all animals, everything is his will, and this will is constantly striving to attain something, and it can never attain it, and that creates suffering. So the whole of nature, there's this famous quote that everything is suffering, the whole of nature is suffering, because we're all striving to attain something. We cannot attain it, and we suffer to attain it, and the whole world and the whole of nature is suffering, and it's all this irrational energy that we're all trying to attain something. And then the third chapter of the book is the world as representation. And for him, the arts are representation of the world, because every time a painter sees something, he looks at the world, and it's his representation of the world in his mind, and he recreates it in the painting. So, and then he looks at the sublime, because that's very important to a lot of 19th century thinkers, is the landscapes and beauty and the sublime, and he writes about the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. And then for him, music is not representation, because music is completely abstract. It doesn't represent the world as it is, and for that reason, he thinks that the music is the will. It's irrational energy. It's the creation of the will. It's a representation of the will. And for him, music, but especially music, but the arts on the whole, and especially music, is that it takes us away from that suffering for brief periods. It's kind of respite from that constant striving and constant desire, and from that suffering. And music and the arts take you away from that. It's kind of outside time and space, and it takes you away from the suffering of the world. And the fourth chapter is the world as will, and he calls it like the denial of the will, because for him, the asceticism, and ascetics are these kind of these mystics, these guys that will fast, they do not eat, they pray for hours, they spend a lot of time alone thinking in their thoughts. And for him, that they deny this suffering and they deny the will, because they take control of their own thoughts. Because if everything is the will and everything is this irrational energy, we don't have our own volition, we don't have free will, and we cannot determine our own choices, because we're constantly driven by this irrational desire and this irrational will. But for him, the ascetic denies it, because he takes control of his own desire and control of his own thoughts, and he controls it through his own strength of will. And music and the arts is kind of temporary release from the suffering, but for him, the ascetic denies the suffering and takes control of his own desires and of his own will. So I've gone over 27 minutes, which is a good thing, which means that I've talked more than in the previous video, and pray to heaven God that the audio worked this time, and a bit of this one to hopefully celebrate a successful video. See you next time.